What would you do if you saw your boss doing something that you thought was illegal? Would you speak up and risk losing your job? Would you go above their head and talk to their supervisor? What if you found out the whole company was in on it? What if they tried to shut you up by ruining your entire life? Well, this woman says that's exactly what happened to her when she blew the whistle on one of the world's biggest banks, JPMorgan Chase. This is Charlie Javice, a young CEO whose fintech company, Frank, seemed to be saving the world and raking in millions in the process, which explains why JPMorgan decided to buy her company in 2021. Now, this acquisition should have been a happy marriage. JPMorgan took Frank under its wing and gave Charlie a job with plenty of resources, and together they were supposed to make Frank an even bigger success, but that never happened. Charlie says that after she was hired, her bosses at the bank gave her orders that she believed were against the law, and after she refused to carry out their plans and expose them to their superiors, she says JPMorgan then fired her without cause, stiffed her out of millions in pay that they owed her, and then slapped her with a sham lawsuit just to cover up their dirty deeds. Now, JPMorgan has a different story though. They say that Charlie is a con artist and that her accusations are nothing but lies. And if you've watched my previous episodes in this series, then you know all about Charlie's shady history, including the many red flags at her company, Frank, and you know about how she likes to twist the truth. So, when it comes to her claims against JPMorgan, not only does the bank deny them and they say they did not do anything illegal, but they also say that Charlie is actually the one who broke the law. They say she's the one who tricked them into buying her company, and they say that their lawsuit is totally justified because she lied to them about how many customers Frank had, and she whipped up a bunch of phony user data to cover her tracks. And that brings us to this episode. Now we've finally arrived at the moment just after the acquisition deal has been signed, right after the bank has shelled out $175 million to buy Charlie's company, and in exchange, Charlie is about to hand them a spreadsheet of absolutely bogus data for the millions of users she told them that Frank had. And spoiler alert, shit's gonna hit the fan, and these two sides are going to war. So get your mugs out, cause we about to guzzle, y'all. After America's biggest bank, JPMorgan Chase, paid all this money to buy Charlie Javice's company, Frank, naturally the bank wanted to start monetizing its investment. And so after Frank finally hands over that precious spreadsheet with the data and contact details for the 4.25 million users that it said it had, JPMorgan is ready to hit up the folks on that list and sell them some financial products. The bank's attorneys wrote that it emailed a random sample of people on the list with offers to open Chase checking and saving accounts, but to say that this email campaign was a flop is an understatement. Of the 400,000 emails that they sent in total, only about 100 people even clicked through to Frank's website, and more than a quarter of the emails were not even delivered. They just straight up bounced. So after this epic fail of a marketing campaign, JPMorgan said it wanted to get to the bottom of what went wrong. And so they say that in June 2020, they launched a major investigation into Frank. Now, the cool thing for JPMorgan is that because it now owns Frank, it also owns all of the shady emails between Charlie and the professor who helped her fake the data and her sketchy co-founder, Olivier Amar, who bought all those 11th hour emails from those data marketing companies. And it also owns all those Slack messages where Frank employees were getting high blood pressure from Charlie's magic numbers. All of those records now belong to JPMorgan. And so JPMorgan tells Charlie, we want our property, so hand us over all of your email communications because we feel like doing some reading. Once JPMorgan digs into those emails, it says that's where it saw exactly how Charlie had carefully plotted to deceive them. They said it was clear that Charlie had given them bogus data and that Frank did not have the 4.25 million users that she said it did. Instead, the true number of users that Frank had was only about 300,000. That's how many people had even created an account on Frank, and fewer than half of those had even started the application for financial aid that Frank offered, which is where they would have entered their prized personal information in the first place. And even though this slide from Frank's pitch deck makes it look like its user base was growing like crazy, internal Slack messages at the company tell a different story. For example, when Charlie asked an engineer at Frank to tell her how many people had registered an account with Frank and had at least started their FAFSA with Frank, the engineer gave her yearly numbers showing that the users of Frank's FAFSA tool had actually been shrinking since 2019. And remember that spreadsheet of supposed customers that Frank gave JPMorgan after the merger? Well, the bank says there was not a single real user on that list because it only contained emails that Frank had bought from those data marketing companies around the time of the acquisition. So JPMorgan says that after it discovered how badly it had been played, they fired Charlie and they fired her co-founder at Frank, Olivier Amar, and they also filed a giant lawsuit against them, alleging that they lied about how successful their company was to trick the bank into buying Frank. Now, you might think that this would be an open and shut case for JPMorgan, especially after all of the evidence that we reviewed in the last video, but Charlie is about to file her own lawsuit against JPMorgan, saying that they're the ones to blame, and I'm gonna be honest, it might make you think twice about who is telling the truth. To some people, lawsuits might seem dry and boring. After all, they're just stacks of paper with pages of double-spaced Times New Roman that spouts off a bunch of legalese. But I promise you, if you take the time to read them, they've got drama that could rival any soap opera. And that is especially true when you're dealing with a salesy showwoman like Charlie Javice and her hotshot attorney Alex Spiro, whose past clients include Alec Baldwin, Megan Thee Stallion, and Elon Musk. So needless to say, when these two teamed up to file a slew of legal claims against JPMorgan, they had an impressive story to tell. In a clapback filing to JPMorgan's lawsuit, Charlie's attorney wrote, JPMorgan Chase has alleged that this case is about Ms. Javice's decision to lie in order to induce JPMorgan to purchase Frank for $175 million. It is not. Following the maxim that the best defense is a good offense, this lawsuit is the culmination of a massive cover-your-ass effort by those responsible inside JPMorgan Chase to shift the blame for a failed and now regretted acquisition to someone they view as an easy target, its young female founder. But JPMorgan's core claims in this lawsuit are even more implausible than they are meritless, and Ms. Javice brings these counterclaims to hold JPMorgan Chase accountable for its unlawful conduct against her. Yeah, so buckle up, y'all, because we're about to go for a ride and hear Charlie's version of events. Let's go back to that all-important spreadsheet of data that this whole saga centers on. JPMorgan says that it thought this list contained Frank's actual users and that it never dreamed that Charlie would fill it with fake synthetic data. But Charlie claims that using synthetic data was JPMorgan's idea in the first place. Charlie's attorney says that in August of 2021, JPMorgan's head of corporate development, Leslie Wims Morris, asked Frank to produce its user data, and he says Charlie was extremely cooperative with this request and that she offered to provide JPMorgan with temporary read-only access to Frank's accounts so that they could view and validate this info directly. But Charlie's attorney says that Leslie declined her offer. Instead, he says that Leslie then asked Frank to create synthetic data and to send it for analysis to Axiom, which he said JPMorgan had often used for this purpose. And it is worth noting that Chase and Axiom did have a relationship. An Axiom exec said in this article that Chase had been an important client of Axiom's for a long time. Now that said, why would JPMorgan want a list of synthetic data when Charlie's attorney says she offered them access to view the real data? Well, Charlie's attorney says it's because JPMorgan was not trying to test the email addresses, but instead, it just wanted to see whether the types of customers that Frank had were different enough from the bank's existing customers to make the acquisition worthwhile. So I'm assuming that means that JPMorgan wanted to check what kind of birth dates and home addresses that Frank users had to confirm that Frank's users were younger and living in different neighborhoods than the customers that Chase already had. And technically, you don't need real data to check that. You just need data that mirrors the real data, especially when it comes to those key demographic traits that you care about. And if all this sounds like Charlie is trying to cook up a sketchy excuse for her fakery, well, her attorney says, why don't we let JPMorgan explain why they love using synthetic data so much? In one of his court filings, he points to this article that is on JPMorgan's own website where the bank says that it often generates synthetic data when it's creating products, and that it comes in handy when the real data is hard to use because of privacy or legal permissions. For example, JPMorgan says that if an AI algorithm needs a massive amount of data to train on, but it can't be fed real customers' data, then synthetic data can step in and get the job done. Its website explains that synthetic data has all the properties of real data, but without the risks, which means you're free to experiment with it and use it to create financial models that can help you make better business decisions. One of JPMorgan's top execs in AI even says you can use it to simulate the full process of a customer's journey that opens an account and asks for a loan. And that sounds like a very worthwhile exercise if you're JPMorgan deciding whether to buy a company with a new customer base that you want to make sure you're going to be able to sell your financial products to. Charlie's attorney says this is exactly why JPMorgan asked Frank to engineer a synthetic data set that mimicked its real customers' attributes, and he said when they did that, Charlie went to work to fulfill their request. He said that first Charlie tried to complete this task in-house at Frank, but once she learned that her head of engineering was not equipped for it, she outsourced the project to a data science professor from a respected university. So basically, Charlie's attorney is saying that this was all perfectly reasonable and on the up and up, and JPMorgan knew exactly what was going on with this synthetic data because they asked for it. Now, I asked an attorney named Keith Altman who specializes in forensic data analysis and data privacy, and he was not buying this story.
Why did she fabricate 4 million names and addresses?
Well, she says it was synthetic data so that they could kind of do some business simulations and simulate the customer journey.
Please, give me a break. This kind of gives attorneys a bad name.
And I have to agree, especially because JPMorgan says if Charlie really thought we wanted fake data instead of real email addresses, then why did Frank rush to buy all those real emails from those data companies for students who had no prior relationship with Frank, and then they put them on a spreadsheet that they gave us after the acquisition and said, here are all our users? It's hard for me to reconcile that, but Charlie's attorney insists that JPMorgan wanted synthetic data, that they were fully aware of what was going on, and that they definitely knew that Frank did not have 4.25 million accounts. And you might be thinking, how is Charlie even beginning to claim that? Well, Charlie's attorney says all you need to do is look at what JPMorgan paid for Frank, and it is obvious they're not telling the truth. He says if JPMorgan really believed that Frank had 4.25 million accounts, then they would have paid way more for her company than 175 million. And I'm not gonna lie, this is a seriously good point. Just look at another company that caters to college students named Chegg, that around the time that JPMorgan bought Frank, it reported it had close to the same amount of users that Frank said it had, so a little over 4 million. And yet Chegg was worth about $12 billion at the time versus a puny 175 mil, so that is a huge discrepancy. The company sold for a fraction of what it should have if it really owned 25% of the market. Charlie's attorney says that this proves that JPMorgan could not have seriously thought that Frank had 4.25 million accounts. And he says the reason JPMorgan gave Frank the valuation it did was because they knew that Frank only had about 300,000 registered accounts. Now, this is where you might be saying, hold up, how could JPMorgan know that Frank only had 300K users when Frank's pitch materials repeatedly flexed that it had 4.25 million users? For example, this slide says that 4.25 million students trust Frank, This one says 4.25 million students and growing. And this one straight up says users, 4.25 million students. Well, Charlie's attorney says there is a totally legit explanation. It just comes down to how you define user.
It depends upon what the meaning of the word is. Yes.
Charlie's lawyer said that Frank measured its customer base in two ways. First, Frank tracked its user signups, referring to users who had provided Frank with certain contact information, either through filling out a FAFSA application on Frank's site or by creating a user account. Second, as Frank grew, it began also to track its website users, meaning unique visitors who interacted with or landed on the site. This was a valuable metric for Frank to begin tracking because as Frank's business model evolved, Frank was no longer simply a FAFSA application tool. Instead, it was becoming a leading website, offering free financial advice and content to students and their families, well beyond those who chose to use the application tool. As such, and because Frank was a free website, the number of users that visited the site to view its content, even without signing up, was a highly relevant growth metric. Now, there is some validity to this argument. I mean, media platforms and content creators don't just get paid based on the number of subscribers or followers they have. They get paid based on how many people view their content, regardless of whether those folks are subscribed. And that's because the attention of certain audiences is worth a lot of money. And that attention is exactly what Charlie's attorney says JPMorgan was paying for when it bought Frank and what it got. The bank scored access to the young, diverse audience that visited Frank's website that JPMorgan could not attract on its own. So, just to recap so we're clear, Charlie is claiming that Frank counted its website visitors as its users. And so when Frank said that it had 4.25 million users, it meant that 4.25 million people had visited its website. And Google Analytics showed that it did have 4.25 million visits, according to a JPMorgan court filing. Now, Charlie's attorney also argues that there was nothing shady at all about that last-minute update that Charlie requested to Frank's website right before a big investment meeting where she told her team to increase the number of people that Frank had helped from 350K to over 4 million. Charlie's attorney says, look, at first, Frank was sharing its FAFSA tool users, and then as it grew into its role as a content provider, it just updated its stats to show how many people trusted its resources. And so he says Frank was being totally honest because both numbers were true. Charlie's attorney also says she explained all of this to JPMorgan in due diligence meetings when they specifically asked her about these two different figures. But despite that, the nagging thought in my mind is it feels like a serious stretch to equate a website visitor with a user. I would never use those terms interchangeably, and I'm not the only one who feels like Charlie was reaching here because Frank employees also question her logic on internal Slack messages. 4.25 million is users that landed on Frank in who knows what time frame. Oh geez. In my 2.5 years, with all the testing I've done, I feel like I was 1 million of those users. LOL. And this message really gets to the heart of the issue. Just because someone visited Frank's website did not necessarily mean that they were Frank's customer. They could have been anybody. Competitors, investors, journalists. Frank had no way to confirm that all its website visitors were students, and it definitely had no right to say that they all trusted Frank. Maybe they landed on Frank's site, saw its deceptive marketing, and immediately bounced. And yet Frank still claimed that 4.25 million students trust Frank for all their money needs. Later, Frank even bumped it up to 5.25 million, saying that these students trusted Frank for being a quick and easy way to apply for aid, for having bank-level security, and for having happy human support. All features of its FAFSA tool, not of its website content. So I see some huge holes in Charlie's defense, and JPMorgan has its own clapbacks to her claims. JPMorgan says that they have proof that Charlie did not mean website visitors when she said 4.25 million users, and they have submitted a lot of exhibits to the court to support their argument. For example, they shared email records from due diligence during acquisition talks where Frank and JPMorgan were arranging for Frank's data to be verified before the merger. And in those emails, a JPMorgan executive sends Charlie a spreadsheet with blanks to fill in about Frank's user base. And at the top of the spreadsheet is the question, how many unique customer accounts exist? Now, when Charlie sends the spreadsheet back to the exec with all the blanks filled in, she answers that question that there were over 4 million customer accounts. On top of that, JPMorgan says that their team took extensive notes during those long due diligence meetings with Frank before the acquisition, where they said that Charlie did most of the talking. And in those notes, they wrote cumulative users equals 4.25 million, and then they define a user as someone who enters their contact details, meaning someone who was a registered user on Frank and not just a website visitor. So this appears to be some very damning evidence against Charlie, but despite all of these documents, her attorney insists that there is no way that JPMorgan really believed that Frank had millions of accounts. He says nobody in their right mind could seriously think that a massive financial entity like JPMorgan would be that dumb. He says, look, this is an international bank with tons of resources, and before it decided to buy Frank, it deployed a whole team with dozens of highly sophisticated, experienced experts who looked the company up and down before pulling the trigger. He writes, JPMorgan Chase's diligence questions were extensive and comprised more than 1,300 separate requests that were meticulously tracked. He says that after all that fine-tooth combing through loads of data and records, there is just no way that the seasoned pros at JPMorgan honestly thought that Frank had over 4 million accounts, because it would be obvious that this isn't true to someone who just knew very basic arithmetic. For example, Charlie's attorney points to one of Frank's slides that says the company's cost to acquire each FAFSA account was $4.45. But if you multiply that times 4.25 million users, then that'd be almost 19 million that we spent on marketing. But he says JPMorgan knew that Frank did not spend anywhere near 19 million on marketing, because Frank told them in many other due diligence documents that it only spent $2 million on marketing. And so he says it is BS that JPMorgan now wants to pretend that their thorough team of finance wizards did not do this basic math equation, and that they now want to act like Frank was trying to deceive them somehow, when obviously Frank was not hiding anything from them. He argues that JPMorgan knew exactly what it was getting, and that is why they paid the price they paid for Frank. Now, if you're thinking, I don't know about this argument, this does not convince me that Charlie is innocent in this situation, well, just wait, because we have not even gotten to the juiciest parts of her side of the story. Up next, she's not just going to defend herself against JPMorgan's claims, but she's going to accuse them of being the ones who tried to break the law, and she says when she blew the whistle on them in the name of justice, they threw her under the bus and tried to scapegoat her for their dirty deeds. This episode is brought to you thanks to the generous support of viewers who join my Patreon. If you're able to give a small monthly contribution, that goes a long way in supporting these investigations into scammers and schemers so that we can help expose them and help people avoid financial harm. You also get first access to behind-the-scenes channel news, and you can help me decide video topics, thumbnails, and merch designs. Not to mention, at the top level, you get an exclusive Thirsty Stan mug. And on that note, I want to give a very special shout out to my Thirsty Stans, DNAG247, Nick Herman, and Randy Lau. Your support means everything to me. I appreciate y'all so much. Throughout this series on Charlie Javice, we've talked a lot about email addresses. They seem to be at the center of this whole story, right? And email addresses are at the heart of JPMorgan's case, because they say Charlie gave them fake ones and that's why they were cheated out of money. But Charlie's attorney says that when JPMorgan bought Frank, it was never about the emails, because he says that everybody involved in this deal knew from the jump that JPMorgan was not allowed to profit off of Frank's data. He writes, all parties understood that JPMorgan Chase could not monetize historical FAFSA data. There are a range of privacy and consumer protection laws and regulations that restrict the use of student data generated from the FAFSA. Charlie's attorney says that during negotiations for the merger, lawyers for Frank and JPMorgan met and talked about all of this. He wrote, the parties discussed that Frank was not monetizing FAFSA in any way, and if Frank were to attempt to do so, it could no longer assist students in filing FAFSA forms. They also discussed that Frank and any potential acquirer would not be monetizing the data of Frank's existing users who had filed the FAFSA. He said this meant that JPMorgan Chase could acquire Frank to gain access to future student users and to better serve their current customers, but JPMorgan was not buying a list of Frank's historical users or their information for direct marketing. Besides, Charlie's attorney said, if JPMorgan just wanted 4 million student emails, they could buy those addresses online for way cheaper, as we've all seen by now. That's why he says that JPMorgan was not paying Frank for email addresses. Instead, it was paying for the Frank brand. He wrote, the strategic value of Frank to JPMorgan Chase lay in access to a new student audience, meaning new website content visitors to chase.com, who, thanks to Frank, would now view Chase as a trusted resource for all manner of content related to student college planning and financial needs. That same number of users or more would presumably continue to visit and use the Frank content and resources in the future once hosted within JPMorgan Chase's broader website and app, thus driving an entirely new and largely untapped demographic to JPMorgan Chase and opening the door to long-term banking and services relationships with these potential customers outside the student aid or FAFSA platform. So that's what Charlie claims that JPMorgan was buying, but her attorney says that everything changed after the acquisition and that the bank did a 180 on their original plans. He says that around October 2021, about a couple months after the deal went down, Charlie's supervisor at Chase, Sonali Divalek, shared with her that the bank planned to email existing Frank users to try to sell them checking accounts and credit cards, and that Chase wanted to advertise itself on Frank's FAFSA dashboard. Charlie's attorney also said that her boss Sonali gave her a quota for the number of new college checking accounts that Frank was supposed to acquire. After learning that JPMorgan planned to push their financial products on Frank's hard-earned customers, Charlie's attorney said she was shook to the core. Charlie, being the ethical, law-abiding citizen that she is, and that we've seen her be in past episodes in this series, she could not just sit by and watch JPMorgan spam these students when she believed that they were violating the law. And so Charlie says she had to stand up and fight for justice, and she blew the whistle on her superiors. And so she went to the bank's legal department and she told them this is a bait and switch on Frank's customers. Her attorney says she immediately objected, and she told her boss that she thought this plan would be illegal and that the quota was not realistic. He also said that Charlie told her boss that they should get a lawyer's opinion and that she would not allow her team to move forward with this marketing plan until she got a memo from the legal department saying that it was okay. But he says that Charlie never got that memo from the bank. Her attorney wrote, Frank had built a reliable brand that had gained the trust of millions, and now JPMorgan Chase would assume Frank's voice to lure the students to credit cards and personal loans rather than to the long-term financial wellness that Frank preached. And there is so much wrong with this paragraph, I don't even know where to begin. First of all, why are we still clinging to this idea that Frank had gained the trust of millions when they only had a few 100,000 accounts? And so you should probably stop repeating that lie. Second, Frank was not even worthy of anybody's trust because it used deceptive marketing to sell its loans, which got it in trouble with the Federal Trade Commission. And third, Frank definitely can't act like it cared about students' financial wellness when its growth roadmap ends with buy now, pay later. Also, I'm sure the reason that Charlie was so vehemently opposed to JPMorgan emailing these students had nothing to do with the fact that she faked the data and that she was worried she was going to get busted. No, it had to do with her upstanding moral character.
First of all, it's unimaginable to me that she did not know why Chase bought Frank. They bought Frank so they could market to these people. I mean, what did they pay for?
Well, JPMorgan says it can tell you what it paid for because the bank has submitted plenty of exhibits to the court that they say proves Charlie is full of it. First of all, JPMorgan points out that Frank explicitly pitched itself to potential bank buyers as a sales machine for financial products targeting college students. For example, this slide from its pitch deck shows that the total number of open college card accounts has fallen over 60% since 2009. That's when that Federal Card Act went into effect that I covered in the last episode. You know, the law that stopped banks from marketing on college campuses and from giving high-interest loans to students who could not pay them back. Frank was very aware of that law, and it pitched itself as banks' big opportunity to get back in the game and acquire millions of new students annually at under $5 a pop and sell them checking accounts, credit cards, and student loans. Frank also pointed out how easy it would be for banks to do this thanks to the unique data set of the 136-question student FAFSA survey that provides user-approved access to unparalleled data and insights. In an email where Charlie is refining one of Frank's pitches to a potential bank investor, she includes this in the talking points. FAFSA has 136 data points and covers all financial product KYC and applications. Now, if you don't know, KYC stands for Know Your Customer, and this is an identity check that banks are required to do before they give you an account to make sure you are who you say you are. And Charlie's saying that's going to be a piece of cake for you because our FAFSA tool has already collected all the data you're going to need to verify somebody's identity. Frank also pitched that banks could seamlessly upsell and cross-sell customers with a complete profile with one click. Here's another slide that says this too. Frank is a centralized suite of products where students can apply for aid and other financial products in one click after they file a FAFSA for seamless KYC and onboarding. And remember how Charlie's attorney said that she was so distraught after she learned that JPMorgan wanted to advertise on Frank's FAFSA dashboard? Well, that is confusing for me because here's an email from Charlie that she sent during acquisition talks that says her company planned to embed Chase card services with Frank through the Frank Scholar card, which it would integrate into the Frank FAFSA flow. And by the way, I think that Scholar card might have been a way to revive those profitable free gifts that banks used to give on college campuses to students who enrolled for a credit card, because JPMorgan wrote in its notes from Frank's due diligence meetings that the Scholar card would offer a $50 scholarship if you signed up. So all of this raises a lot of questions for me about how sincere Charlie is being in her argument, but it's not just these pitch materials that are giving me doubts. I'm also skeptical because of the vague language that her attorney uses in court filings when he talks about the marketing plans that JPMorgan was pushing. Even though he clearly wants to give the impression that the bank's plans were illegal, I didn't see where he outright says that they were, or that he cited any laws that JPMorgan would be violating, which I would think he would be quick to do if they were really acting like criminals. Instead, Charlie's attorney just says that she believed that JPMorgan was breaking the law, so she just sincerely believed it in her heart of hearts. Now, was this belief fabricated as a defense strategy to paint Charlie as the hero fighting against the big bad wolf JPMorgan? Well, I'll let you decide that for yourself. I did ask attorney Keith Altman, who specializes in data privacy and education cases, whether he thought that Chase broke the law, and he said,
I don't know that Chase did anything illegal. Stupid. I don't know that it's illegal.
He also pointed out that there is a federal law in the U.S. called the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA, and that law regulates how student records can be used by educational institutions, but Keith said that he didn't think that Frank or Charlie would be subject to that.
She's not an educational institution. She's a service provider. Seems to me FERPA doesn't apply on its face.
Now, of course, there are lots of other privacy laws, including ones that are just for financial institutions, but if JPMorgan was breaking one of those laws by sending these marketing emails, then why would it admit to doing so in its own court filings? Wouldn't they be incriminating themselves and confessing to a crime? And if that were the case, then why have the feds arrested Charlie but not JPMorgan? All of this gives me trouble swallowing Charlie's allegations, but for now, let's hear her out and get to the rest of her side of the story. Charlie's attorney says that after her boss at Chase, Sonali Divalek, told her about the bank's marketing plans that Charlie believed were possibly against the law, He says that Charlie then voiced her concerns to JPMorgan's legal team on a conference call in November 2021. But he says instead of listening to her and taking her seriously, they told Charlie to shut up and keep quiet. He wrote, "The legal department admonished Ms. Javice for sharing this view and warned her never to express such sentiments again in writing." But Charlie's attorney says that did not deter her. He says she went even higher up the ranks at Chase and met with the CEO of the Consumer Banking Division, Jen Piepsack, and he says that after Charlie shared her concerns with Jen was understanding and told Charlie that Frank would not move forward with this marketing plan. But he says that was not the end of it, because once word got back to Charlie's superiors that she'd gone above their heads and snitched on them, they were furious with her and they were determined to get revenge. Charlie's attorney says she became the target of a bitter harassment campaign by her bosses. He says they launched, quote, petty investigations to get back at her that accused her of misusing her expense account to pay for a hotel when she attended a business conference and to pay for lunch for her team when she says they were working. Charlie's attorney insists that these accusations from her bosses were totally unjustified and that they were just retaliating against her for speaking up about how she thought they were misusing Frank's data. And he says that Charlie was not the only one who thought that JPMorgan was out of line. He says that earlier that summer, the Department of Education had talked to JPMorgan and that it had confirmed some of Charlie's legal concerns and that they discussed the rules around using Frank's data. Charlie's attorney says that after that little discussion with the DOE, JPMorgan's legal department jumped in and told its consumer banking division to dial back some of its marketing plans. Now, Charlie's attorney says that this was not the only drama involving the DOE that put a damper on the bank's plans for Frank. He says that in July of 2022, not even a year after JPMorgan bought Frank, the Department of Education announced that it was going to require two-factor authentication for anybody submitting a FAFSA to apply for financial aid. So that meant that a student would need to verify their identity on two devices, like a computer and a phone. But Charlie's attorney said that Frank could not do that since it was a third party submitting the form. And he said this change threatened to make Frank's whole FAFSA tool absolutely useless. He said that once JPMorgan heard the news about the DOE's two-factor update, the bank suddenly shut down Frank's FAFSA tool instead of looking into whether they could find a workaround. Then Charlie's attorney says that 1 week after the DOE's two-factor announcement, JPMorgan told Charlie to hand over all of her emails because he said that someone at the bank had accused her of misleading JPMorgan during the merger negotiations by not telling them about this big update from the Department of Education, even though he said she had no way of knowing about it because she found out at the same time they did when the DOE announced it. All in all, Charlie's attorney argues that JPMorgan majorly screwed up this merger. They tried to shove their products down students' throats with no regard for the genuine, caring relationship that Frank had built with its users. They had tried to bulldoze past privacy laws and exploit sensitive FAFSA data just so they could make a buck. And then once the news dropped that the DOE was requiring two-factor authentication, that threatened to spoil their big investment and make them look like total idiots, and they didn't want to take the fall. Charlie's attorney says that after they failed so miserably with this acquisition, they needed someone to scapegoat for their mess, and who better to blame than the new kid on the block, Charlie, who had just called them out to the legal department for misbehaving. Her attorney wrote, after their woeful mismanagement of the Frank integration process, they needed someone to point the finger at, and they found that person in Miss Javice, an outsider whose youth and lack of institutional longevity made her an easy target. Charlie says that in a final act of retaliation, the managers at JPMorgan Bank decided to fire her the day before she was supposed to receive her $20 million retention bonus. And so she's accusing them of dropping her at the perfect time so that they could avoid paying her her hard-earned compensation. That's why JPMorgan filed this whole sham of a lawsuit against her, Charlie says, because they needed to cover their tracks for all their shady mistakes. Charlie's attorney also said that they sent her a letter ordering her to pay back the over $160,000 they'd already paid her, and that they've also refused to pay her another $8 million that she's owed. Now, it's in late 2020 that JPMorgan dumps Charlie from her job and the two sides are fighting about her compensation, but Charlie is dead set on getting paid, and so by December of that year, 5 days before Christmas, she slaps JPMorgan with a lawsuit saying that they cheated her out of money. Her attorney says, look, she deserves that money because JPMorgan got exactly what they bargained for with this acquisition, and so it's not fair for them to refuse to pay for that. He writes, though Frank remains a viable investment, there's no reason that it cannot still be a profitable asset for JPMorgan Chase. Well, I can think of a few reasons. Ms. Javice has been damaged by JPMorgan's conduct and brings these counterclaims to redress the wrong she has suffered. Now, 2 days after Charlie files her suit against JPMorgan, they sue her back for fraud, saying that she lied to them about Frank's user base, but Charlie's attorney says that their whole case is nothing but a sham. He says the bank just cooked up these claims against Charlie to cover their tracks for acting shady and because they needed to save face to their investors after they poured millions into an investment that they promised would be so great and would bring them all this business, but that ended up going nowhere because they had failed so epically at their jobs. Not because the company was fake, but because her bosses at the bank were just not smart enough. So, this is quite a story that Charlie and her defense team have laid out here, but I will say that despite her wild version of events, I do see plenty of reasons to think that JPMorgan may not have been an innocent victim in this deal. Ever since JPMorgan filed its big fraud suit against Charlie Javice, she has been dragged through the press as a scheming con artist, but the case has also cast a spotlight on the bank that some would say it would have preferred to avoid. Sure, the Frank acquisition was a bust that cost JPMorgan millions, and so you might think, of course they wanted to hold Charlie accountable for that huge loss, but if you're a powerhouse bank that people pay for financial expertise, then it might be even worse for your business to advertise the fact that you fell for a 20-something-year-old's list of fake emails. So, did JPMorgan really want to sue Charlie and put this whole fiasco on blast? Well, let's look back at the timeline. It was in June of last year that JPMorgan says it first started investigating Charlie, but it didn't sue her until half a year later, and it only did so after she filed suit against them.
Nobody looks good in this thing, and I just don't think Chase can say that they are the victim that they claim to be. You know, they're pretty savvy, smart people.
It's hard to believe that JPMorgan did not know something was off with Charlie's numbers. Just the valuation alone that they gave the company caused this into question. Plus, they should have been looking for signs of fraud before they bought the company because that is one of the main goals of the due diligence process. But as we've seen, the experts do not always do the homework they're supposed to. Major media networks did not investigate Charlie before exalting her on their airwaves. Big-name investors still pumped money into Frank despite all of its red flags. And so couldn't JPMorgan Chase just have taken the same shortcuts? Well, attorney Keith Altman isn't so sure.
On its face, that she claimed to have 4 million customers, it doesn't pass the smell test. How is she making any money at this? How is she ever going to make any money at this? How is anybody going to make any money at this? When you put those two things together, man, this should have been red flags all the way around.
It's a head-scratcher for me to think that JPMorgan missed the alleged fake accounts during due diligence. It would be very odd to me to go through a $175 million transaction without testing the emails. Startup due diligence is literally fake.
I mean, look, frankly, this whole thing's a show. Based on what I have seen and heard, and I'm sure there's more to the story, you know, there's her side, their side, and the truth, and probably all three are different. You know, obviously, if she did what she's accused of, that's fraud. On the other hand, how the hell could Chase be so stupid? You know, you do your due diligence before you make the purchase. I mean, I think they would just googly-eyed.
And there's plenty of evidence to support that. JPMorgan CEO Jamie Dimon was facing enormous pressure to make this dusty old-school bank look hip to younger generations and minority groups. The year before the Frank merger, Jamie had written in an annual report that banks were facing enormous competitive threats from virtually every angle, and he pointed out how banks are playing an increasingly smaller role in the financial system.
Lots to digest from Jamie Dimon's annual letter this morning. In it, a warning to shareholders saying, quote, fintech and big tech are here big time.
He mentions Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google. He mentions Walmart as well. He says their strengths are extraordinary, and at a minimum, they will all embed payment systems within their ecosystems and create a marketplace of bank products and services. I wonder, when fintech hears that from a guy like Dimon, do they think we got him where we want him?
Well, maybe they did, because Dimon also wrote in this letter that JPMorgan was ready to buy fintech companies to acquire new clients. He wrote, "We need to move faster and bolder in how we attack new markets. Sometimes new markets look too small or appear not to be critical to our customer base until they are. We intend to be a little more aggressive here." So, did JPMorgan get a little too aggressive in their acquisition strategy? Well, Charlie's attorneys wrote that after Jamie Dimon heard that one of his competitors was trying to buy Frank, he told Charlie personally that he thought JPMorgan should, quote, get the deal done with Frank. Her attorney said that Jamie said this in July of 2021, and that was the same month that JPMorgan was conducting due diligence on Frank. He wrote, "In short, Jamie Dimon was eager to buy Frank, and he said that Jamie wanted to close the deal before the start of the college application season." Now, most schools open their college apps on August 1st, and by August 8th, the merger agreement between JPMorgan and Frank was signed. So, was this acquisition too rushed? Was JPMorgan so hungry for customers that it cut corners during due diligence? Should they have suspected something was sketchy with Frank's users going up and up and up, and its marketing spend going down to almost zero? Should they have said, this looks too good to be true? Should they have tried to verify this exceptional organic growth by strolling over to Reddit, where you would expect to see at least a few posts with people gushing about how Frank got him all this financial aid, but instead, there are just a couple posts asking whether Frank is a scam with comments like, "Do not use this." JPMorgan also could have done a quick search on Twitter, filtering for tweets that mentioned Frank's account, where they would have found plenty of people who were not fans of Charlie's business. Don't file with Frank, y'all. Frank isn't the answer. I don't get it. I'm not giving you my IRS data. Sorry, I don't understand what this is. Apparently, there must have been so many people wondering whether Frank was a fraud that the company's own FAQs page included the question, "Are you a scam?" To which the company, of course, answers no, and then we can learn more about why Frank is not a scam here, except, oh no, we can't because nothing's linked here. And y'all, this is such a glaring sign that Frank was not growing like crazy through word of mouth, because in its own FAQs, it has to argue that it's not a scam. Y'all, this should have clued somebody in. But if you look at JPMorgan's past, they have a rich history of ignoring red flags as long as they can make some money. For example, when they ignored red flags in the biggest Ponzi scheme in history, the $65 billion Bernie Madoff fraud, a scheme that JPMorgan Chase admits that it covered up, and instead of warning people about it, it pulled its own money from Bernie's funds just months before his arrest. And so given that, why would it care about Charlie's lies? Especially because if you think about it, JPMorgan and Charlie were really chasing the same goal. Charlie was trying to profit by pushing predatory deceptive products on unsuspecting customers, which is a business that JPMorgan Chase specializes in. Whether they're collecting debts that people don't owe, wrongly charging customers overdraft fees, accepting illegal mortgage kickbacks, manipulating entire markets, having widespread record-keeping failures, or letting their employees use WhatsApp to keep the feds from finding out about all of the above, JPMorgan Chase does not exactly have a history of integrity.
JPMorgan Chase has agreed to settle fraud charges for its role in the financial crisis. The SEC says the company misled customers about risky mortgage investments. JPMorgan Chase has tentatively agreed to pay the biggest corporate fine ever.
Remember that giant housing market crash back in 2008? Well, after that happened, JPMorgan got slapped with a record fine after it admitted that it made bad loans to customers who couldn't afford them, and then turned around and sold those loans to investors and lied to them about what they were buying, which, come to think of it, sounds extremely familiar. So even though JPMorgan wants to act like it's such an innocent victim that got scammed by this conniving young con artist, y'all, that is not the full story, because these two have way more in common than JPMorgan wants you to think. For now, though, the bank has a very powerful ally on its side of the fight, the federal government. Which brings me to the next episode, because this epic saga is far from over. Coming up, we're looking at what is going to end up happening to Charlie and what kind of consequences she could be facing, because she is not only fighting JPMorgan in court, but now she's up against serious criminal lawsuits from the DOJ and the SEC. These agencies have arrested Charlie on a slew of fraud charges that could land her in prison for the rest of her life. But while she's awaiting trial, she's been busy fiercely building up her defenses. Up next, you're going to see how she's made a sudden move across the country to a state with laws that are conveniently loved by thieves, and you're also going to see how she's been moving her money around and has set up some sketchy shell companies, plus how she's even found a boyfriend with his own very interesting career history. On top of that, we're going to look at some of the impressive legal loopholes that Charlie's attorney has found, including the contract language that he says gets her off the hook, plus the major victory that he's already won for her in court that's forcing JPMorgan to pay Charlie's bills. So if you want to see that and much more in the next episode, then make sure you're subscribed so you can find out when it drops. And because these deep dives take some time to research and produce, and YouTube has a short attention span, I also recommend clicking the bell to turn on notifications so that the platform does not forget that you still like me. Also, if you want to give this video a like, then I would really appreciate that. If you want to see more videos like this where I investigate scammers and schemers, then subscribe so you can slurp up all the tea I'm spilling here on Guzzle about shady moneymakers. Alright y'all, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.